In the final hours before a kingdom collapses, history rarely announces itself with thunder. It often arrives quietly. No bells rang. No armies marched. No crowds gathered in the streets. Only a king, alone in a vast palace, still believed he ruled. The candles burned low in the corridors of power. Stone walls that had stood for centuries seemed unmoved by what was about to unfold. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors. Advisors exchanged glances weighted with secrets. Somewhere beyond the palace gates, forces already set in motion could no longer be stopped. This is not the story of a foolish king. It is not the story of a weak one. This is the story of a capable ruler undone not by enemies at his borders, but by betrayal at his side. A betrayal so complete, so methodical, that by the time the king understood what had happened, he no longer possessed a throne, an army, or even a name that history would protect. What follows is not a single act of treachery, but a slow corrosion of trust. A long conspiracy hidden behind loyalty. A lesson written repeatedly across centuries of political history. Power does not usually fall by force. It is surrendered, piece by piece, to those closest to it. At the beginning of his reign, the kingdom stood secure. Its borders were stable, its treasury full, its institutions respected. Trade routes passed safely through its lands, guarded by disciplined soldiers and enforced by law rather than fear. Foreign envoys spoke of the court with admiration. Rivals treated it with caution. The king inherited more than a crown. He inherited legitimacy. Born into a dynasty that had ruled for generations, his authority rested not only on military strength, but on tradition. His coronation was not contested. The nobility pledged allegiance. The people celebrated. Unlike many rulers before him, he did not ascend through bloodshed. There was no civil war, no disputed succession. His claim was accepted almost without resistance. This, in retrospect, was both his greatest advantage, and his first vulnerability. From the earliest days, the king believed stability was permanent. He believed loyalty, once pledged, endured. He believed institutions were stronger than individuals. History rarely forgives such beliefs. The king did not rule through terror. He believed fear produced obedience, but never devotion. His laws were firm, but predictable. Punishments were measured. Advisors were encouraged to speak openly, even critically. At court, this created an atmosphere unusual for absolute power. Ministers debated policy. Generals argued strategy. Economists warned of long-term risks. The king listened. This openness earned him praise from historians, much later. At the time, it earned him something far more dangerous: confidence. He trusted that transparency created unity. He believed that those who argued with him did so in service of the realm. He rarely questioned motives, only ideas. But power does not reward openness equally. Some saw dialogue. Others saw opportunity. Every ruler has an inner circle. For this king, it consisted of three pillars: the chief advisor, the commander of the royal army, and the steward of the treasury. Each man owed his rise to the king personally. The advisor was brilliant, patient, and deeply knowledgeable in law and diplomacy. He spoke softly and rarely disagreed in public. The general was a veteran of border conflicts, respected by soldiers and feared by enemies. His loyalty seemed unquestionable. The treasurer controlled the flow of coin that sustained the kingdom. Without his approval, no campaign could be funded, no palace maintained, no city fortified. Together, these men did not merely serve the king. They enabled him. And because they enabled him, they also learned how power truly worked. Not from the throne, but around it. The betrayal did not begin with a plot. It began with a compromise. A neighboring state proposed a treaty that favored them slightly more than tradition allowed. The king hesitated. His advisors urged acceptance. The treasury warned of economic strain if trade routes closed. The advisor framed the agreement as temporary, reversible. The king agreed. Nothing collapsed. Nothing exploded. In fact, the treaty stabilized relations and increased short-term revenue. The decision appeared wise. But something subtle changed. The king had allowed others to define what was necessary. From that moment, future compromises became easier. Each one seemed small. Each one logical. Each one reasonable. History is not altered by dramatic decisions alone. It is shaped by a series of minor concessions that, combined, transform power itself. Within the palace, loyalties began to rearrange. Nobles no longer sought direct audiences with the king. They appealed instead to the advisor, whose influence now shaped access itself. Military officers pledged allegiance not just to the crown, but to the general who controlled promotions and deployments. Merchants negotiated with the treasury before presenting anything to the throne. None of this appeared treasonous. It was efficient. It was practical. It was modern. And it slowly relocated authority away from the king, without ever removing his crown. The king noticed none of this as danger. From his perspective, the kingdom functioned smoothly. Rebellions were rare. Revenues stable. The army disciplined. He believed his reign was defined by balance. But power rarely disappears suddenly. It migrates. By the time the king began sensing resistance to his commands, the transformation was already complete. Orders were delayed. Policies were reinterpreted. Military actions required consultation. The throne remained intact. Its influence did not. The advisor never challenged the king openly. Instead, he reframed reality. Failures were explained away. Successes were attributed to collective effort. Warnings were delivered gently, never urgently. The king trusted him completely. That trust allowed the advisor to become indispensable. And once someone becomes indispensable to power, removing them becomes impossible without destabilizing everything. This was not accidental. It was strategy. The realization came too late. A crisis erupted at the border, an uprising supported by foreign interests. The king ordered immediate military action. The army did not move. The general requested additional funding. The treasury cited budget constraints. The advisor recommended negotiation. For the first time in his reign, the king's command did not translate into action. He was still king. But he no longer governed. What followed was not a coup. It was worse. A council convened for the good of the realm. Emergency powers were transferred temporarily. The king was asked to step back, briefly, symbolically. He agreed. That was the last decision he ever made as ruler. Once authority left his hands, it never returned. The crown remained on his head only until it was no longer needed. The king was not executed. He was erased. Records diminished his role. Chroniclers emphasized the council's wisdom. His name became a footnote. The kingdom endured. The institutions survived. The betrayers ruled. History would later argue whether this was justice or treason. But power itself was never confused. This story has repeated itself across civilizations. In empires ancient and modern. In monarchies and republics. In courts, cabinets, and councils. The lesson is constant. A ruler does not lose everything in one night. He loses it the moment he believes loyalty is permanent. Betrayal is rarely loud. It is administrative. It is patient. It is rational. And by the time the crown falls, it has already been hollow for years. Betrayal is often imagined as a single decisive act. A dagger in the dark. A door left open. A name whispered to the enemy. But in reality, the most successful betrayals are not acts. They are systems. In this kingdom, betrayal did not require secrecy alone. It required structure, procedures that appeared legitimate, processes that looked responsible, and language that sounded reasonable. Councils were formed. Committees multiplied. Emergency frameworks were introduced temporarily, then extended indefinitely. Each mechanism diluted the king's authority while claiming to protect it. Nothing illegal occurred. Nothing openly rebellious. Power simply changed shape. And once power becomes procedural, it no longer belongs to a person. It belongs to those who control the procedures. The court adapted quickly. Courtiers learned which voices mattered. Petitions addressed to the king were quietly redirected. Praise still flowed toward the throne, but decisions flowed elsewhere. Public rituals continued. The king presided over ceremonies. His image remained on banners and seals. Coins still bore his likeness. But symbolism replaced command. This was not accidental. It was essential. Removing the king too early would provoke resistance. Leaving him visible reassured the population while power was reorganized behind the scenes. This was betrayal with patience. For the people, life continued. Markets opened. Taxes were collected. Soldiers patrolled the roads. Laws were enforced. There was no famine, no invasion, no immediate collapse. This was perhaps the most dangerous illusion of all. The absence of chaos created acceptance. The absence of suffering created silence. And silence created legitimacy. History shows that populations rarely resist political betrayal if daily life remains intact. Revolutions are born from hunger and humiliation, not from constitutional manipulation. And so the people never rose. They never needed to. In private, the king finally understood. The isolation became unmistakable. Messages went unanswered. Audiences were postponed. Decisions returned rewritten. He attempted to reassert authority. He summoned the general alone. The meeting ended politely, and without result. He confronted the advisor directly. The advisor listened, agreed in principle, and delayed in practice. The king considered dismissal. But dismissing one pillar threatened to collapse the structure that still bore his name. Power had trapped him using stability itself. Here lay the king's final dilemma. To reclaim authority, he would need to destabilize the kingdom. He would need to break the very institutions he once strengthened. He would need to act against the image he had cultivated his entire reign. He hesitated. Betrayers often rely on this moment. They understand that ethical rulers fear chaos more than personal loss. They know such rulers will sacrifice themselves to preserve order. The king chose restraint. And restraint sealed his fate. The official announcement was brief. For reasons of health, reflection, and unity, the king would retire from active governance. A regency council would oversee affairs. The language was gentle, respectful, final. There were no protests, no riots, no executions. The king left the palace through the same gates he had once entered in triumph. He was escorted not by guards, but by memory. Stripped of authority, the king discovered a truth few rulers ever face. Power is not an attribute. It is a relationship. Without obedience, the crown is an ornament. Without enforcement, decrees are words. Without belief, legitimacy is theater. The king lived comfortably. He was treated politely. He was never harmed. But he was no longer consulted. That silence was the final betrayal. The new regime wrote carefully. The king's reign was described as stable but transitional. His removal framed as necessary modernization. His virtues acknowledged, his authority minimized. No lies were told outright. But emphasis changed. History does not require falsehood to distort. Only selection. Over time, the king's role faded. His name survived, but without weight. This is how rulers truly disappear. This story is not unique. It echoes through the Roman Senate, where emperors ruled in name while administrators governed in fact. Through medieval courts, where regents eclipsed monarchs. Through modern states, where leaders become symbols while systems decide. Betrayal evolves with political structure. But its logic remains unchanged. Betrayal succeeds because it feels rational. It avoids bloodshed. It promises continuity. It speaks the language of responsibility. It convinces even its victim that resistance would be reckless. And so power transfers quietly, from person to process, from throne to table. History often judges fallen rulers harshly. But this king did not fall because he lacked intelligence, courage, or vision. He fell because he trusted systems more than human ambition. Because he believed loyalty outlasted interest. Because he thought stability protected authority, when in truth, it concealed its erosion. The greatest betrayal was not committed by any single man. It was committed by the idea that power could be shared without consequence. Power can be delegated. Authority can be distributed. But sovereignty cannot be divided without disappearing. The king learned this too late. Every era believes it has outgrown palace intrigue. Every system believes it is immune to personal ambition. History disagrees. Betrayal does not announce itself as treason. It arrives as reform. As efficiency. As cooperation. And when a king finally looks down to grasp his power, he discovers it has already passed through other hands. Not stolen. Not seized. But given away. Power reveals its absence not when commands are disobeyed, but when they are politely acknowledged and quietly ignored. In the months following the king's removal from active rule, decrees still bore his seal. Announcements were still read in his name. Yet nothing originated from him anymore. Decisions emerged fully formed from councils. Policies arrived without consultation. Military movements were justified after they occurred. The king became a spectator to governance performed in his likeness. This was not disrespect. It was irrelevance. And irrelevance, once established, is irreversible. At court, memory adjusted itself. Officials who once competed for the king's favor now spoke of him with distant admiration, as one might recall a previous era. New alliances formed. New hierarchies solidified. The rituals remained unchanged, but their meaning shifted. When the king entered a hall, people still bowed. Yet their eyes no longer searched his face for instruction. Their loyalty had relocated, quietly and completely. This is how political systems heal themselves after removing a leader. They forget. The commander of the army never declared himself ruler. He did not need to. His reward was autonomy. Military budgets expanded without debate. Campaigns were launched without royal oversight. Promotions answered to him alone. The army, once loyal to the crown, now obeyed a structure, one that no longer required a king at its summit. Soldiers swear loyalty not to symbols, but to certainty. The general provided certainty. The advisor did not seek monuments. His ambition was subtler. He reshaped law. Under his guidance, reforms were codified. Emergency councils became permanent bodies. Authority was redistributed to prevent future instability. What had begun as betrayal hardened into doctrine. Future generations would inherit a system that made such a king impossible. This was the advisor's true victory. Not power, but permanence. The residence granted to the former king was comfortable, guarded, and silent. Visitors were rare. Letters arrived infrequently. News came filtered, delayed, and incomplete. This was not imprisonment. It was containment. The king spent long hours walking familiar corridors, now stripped of urgency. He read histories, some written during his reign, others long before it. Only then did he recognize the pattern. Others had lived this ending before him. The king did not rage. He did not plot. He reflected. And reflection offered no remedy. He understood now where authority had slipped away. At each moment he chose harmony over command, process over decision, trust over control. These choices had once seemed virtuous. History would later call them fatal. When the king died, the announcement was brief. There were no days of mourning. No grand procession. No disruption to governance. The machinery of state continued uninterrupted. That continuity was the final proof of his erasure. A ruler is not remembered by how long he lived, but by how long his absence is felt. The kingdom did not pause. In the decades that followed, historians praised the transition. They spoke of peaceful reform, of institutional maturity, of progress without bloodshed. They were not entirely wrong. But they missed the deeper truth. The betrayal succeeded because it borrowed the king's moral authority to destroy his political authority. It used his restraint as cover, his legitimacy as camouflage, his trust as leverage. The system that replaced the king proved efficient, but brittle. Without a central authority capable of decisive action, conflicts multiplied. Councils stalled. Responsibility diffused. No single figure could be blamed. And so mistakes accumulated. Betrayal removes tyranny, but it also removes accountability. Centuries later, scholars would debate the king's legacy. Some would argue he was necessary, a bridge between eras. Others would label him naive. A few would defend his ethics as rare. None would deny one thing. He lost everything not because he was defeated, but because he was outmaneuvered. This story survives because it transcends monarchy. Kings fall. Titles change. Thrones disappear. But power still gathers. Still circulates. Still betrays. Executives replaced by boards. Leaders constrained by advisors. Presidents overshadowed by institutions. The pattern remains. Betrayal is not personal. It does not despise the ruler. It does not envy him. It simply calculates that he is no longer necessary. And once power reaches that conclusion, sentiment becomes irrelevant. Imagine the throne room years later. The chair remains. Polished. Impressive. Empty. Tour guides speak of its former occupant in the past tense. Visitors photograph it without reverence. The kingdom still stands. But the king, who once believed loyalty was eternal, exists only as a lesson. A lesson carved not in stone, but in silence. Because the most complete betrayal is the one history barely notices. In the years following the king's disappearance from public life, governance continued, but something intangible was lost. Decisions were made, yet no one embodied them. Laws were enforced, yet no single voice carried moral weight. Authority existed everywhere and nowhere at once. This diffusion of power was celebrated as progress. But it carried a hidden cost. When power lacks a face, it also lacks restraint. Councils argued endlessly. Factions emerged within institutions. Responsibility dissolved into procedure. The kingdom became efficient, but cold. Those who truly governed now remained unseen. They did not appear in portraits. They did not attend ceremonies. Their names were absent from monuments. Yet nothing moved without their approval. These were not kings. They were administrators of influence. Their authority rested not on loyalty, but on leverage, control of information, control of resources, control of delay. This was governance by obstruction rather than command. Slowly, subtly, the people noticed. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But justice became inconsistent. Appeals vanished into committees. Decisions took longer. Explanations grew more complex. The state still functioned, but it no longer felt present. Under the king, power had been distant but comprehensible. Under the system, power became close, but unknowable. The alliance that removed the king was never meant to last. It had been forged by common interest, not shared vision. Once the throne no longer posed a threat, internal rivalries emerged. The general questioned civilian oversight. The treasury demanded limits on military spending. The advisor mediated, until mediation became control. The absence of a king removed the final arbiter. Now, no one could end disputes, only prolong them. One by one, the betrayers faced the logic they had unleashed. The general was accused of ambition. His autonomy reduced. His allies reassigned. The treasurer faced investigations. Records were questioned. His authority fragmented. Even the advisor, master of systems, could not escape them. Committees scrutinized committees. Procedures were used to remove those who had created them. Betrayal, once normalized, does not stop. It escalates. In an unexpected twist, the king's legacy outlived his betrayers. While their names vanished into archives, his endured, not as a ruler, but as a symbol of lost coherence. Poets wrote of his restraint. Scholars debated his ethics. Political thinkers used his fall as warning. The system that replaced him survived, but without reverence. History remembered the king not for his power, but for its absence. The most effective betrayals do not target tyrants. They target decent rulers. They exploit patience. They weaponize trust. They disguise ambition as responsibility. A cruel king provokes resistance. A restrained king invites management. This king was managed out of history. No soldiers marched against the palace. No blood stained the steps. Because violence would have exposed the betrayal. Instead, the conspirators preserved appearances, preserved language, preserved ritual. They let the king rule, until ruling meant nothing. This is how modern power prefers to operate. Centuries passed. The kingdom transformed. Borders shifted. Languages evolved. The monarchy itself eventually disappeared. Yet the story of the king endured. Not because he was great, but because his fall was instructive. Students learned his name when studying the limits of authority. His reign became a case study in how power escapes control without resistance. A ruler's strength is not measured by how loudly he commands, but by how difficult he is to replace. This king was replaced without disruption. That was his tragedy. And his lesson. Every system believes it has solved the problem of power. Every era believes it has made betrayal obsolete. It never does. Power adapts. Ambition learns new languages. Betrayal puts on new uniforms. The throne may vanish, but the dynamic remains. And somewhere, always, a leader will believe loyalty is permanent. History waits patiently for that moment. Long before the king lost his throne, he believed he still controlled events. Reports crossed his desk daily. Summaries were delivered with care. Figures were arranged to suggest balance. Risks were softened with language. This is how power deceives its holder. Information did not stop reaching the king. It was curated. What he received was not false, but incomplete. An incomplete truth is more dangerous than lies, because it never triggers alarm. The king believed he saw everything. In reality, he saw only what others allowed. Words began to change meaning. Consultation replaced command. Consensus replaced decision. Stability replaced control. Each shift sounded enlightened, progressive, responsible. But each one moved authority further away from the throne. By the time the king noticed, he was no longer ruling men, he was managing expectations. The king valued restraint. He believed in persuasion over coercion, institutions over impulse, continuity over disruption. Those who betrayed him understood this perfectly. They framed every challenge as a threat to unity, every assertion of power as unnecessary force, every attempt at control as regression. To resist them, the king would have had to abandon the principles that defined his reign. They did not defeat him. They outgrew him. The king faced a paradox. If he acted decisively, he would contradict the image that legitimized him. If he remained consistent, he would lose authority. Betrayal thrives in such paradoxes. It places its victim in a moral trap, where every available choice strengthens the betrayer's position. The king chose integrity. History rarely rewards that choice in politics. The throne room became a stage. Audiences were held. Ceremonies performed. Ritual language repeated faithfully. But decisions had already been made elsewhere. This separation of image and authority was deliberate. As long as the throne appeared occupied, resistance had no focus. Symbols pacify populations long enough for power to relocate safely. The king never publicly admitted loss. He continued to speak as if he ruled. His addresses were calm, measured, dignified. The people heard continuity. But beneath the surface, the monarchy had already ended. Power had moved on. The council system expanded rapidly. New offices appeared. Jurisdictions overlapped. Authority became layered and obscure. No single figure could be blamed for failure. This was praised as collective responsibility. In practice, it was collective immunity. Mistakes no longer threatened rulers, only processes. Once established, the system resisted change. Any attempt to centralize authority was framed as dangerous. Any call for decisive leadership was labeled reckless. The very memory of monarchy was recast as primitive. The king's fall became justification for his permanent exclusion. The king's world shrank. Not through walls or guards, but through neglect. Conversations shortened. Invitations stopped. Advice ceased. He remained respected. He was no longer needed. This is the quietest form of political death. In solitude, the king reconstructed the past. He remembered moments he had dismissed as minor. Decisions he had delayed. Warnings he had softened. None of them alone seemed fatal. Together, they formed a pattern he could no longer escape. Betrayal had not arrived suddenly. It had grown patiently around him. Future rulers studied this transition carefully. They learned that removing a leader did not require violence, only legitimacy, time, and language. This lesson would echo through centuries. Power learned how to replace authority without resistance. As political systems evolved, betrayal refined itself. It no longer relied on conspiracies. It relied on procedure. It no longer needed secrecy. It needed patience. And it no longer required courage. Only coordination. In one sense, the king was correct. Violence was avoided. Civil war never came. The kingdom survived. But survival is not sovereignty. The state endured, but something irreplaceable was lost. Authority that can act. This story endures because it reveals a truth many prefer to ignore. Power does not disappear when leaders fall. It reorganizes. And those who fail to understand that truth become irrelevant, no matter how legitimate they once were. The camera returns to the empty throne. Dust settles where crowns once rested. Light filters through high windows. Silence fills the chamber. The kingdom continues beyond these walls. But the king, who believed trust was strength, remains behind as a warning. Not of tyranny, but of misplaced faith. Because the most dangerous betrayal is not committed by enemies. It is committed by those who convince a ruler he no longer needs power at all. The kingdom survived, yet the spirit of leadership faltered. Decisions were made, laws enforced, taxes collected, but always at a remove. Authority became abstract. Citizens no longer saw a figure to lead them, they saw only institutions. Trade continued, borders remained secure, but initiative slowed. No one dared act decisively without consulting layers of bureaucracy. Efficiency replaced intuition. Speed gave way to procedure. The king's absence created a kingdom that functioned perfectly, and yet imperfectly. The machinery of governance had no heartbeat. Its gears turned, but only because of routine, not courage. What had begun as personal ambition became doctrine. The advisor, once a human manipulator, now embedded control into the very architecture of power. Emergency councils were codified. Decision-making processes multiplied. Oversight committees expanded. Authority was no longer tied to a person, it was tied to rules. The king had once believed institutions were shields for power. They became the cage. History remembers innovation as progress, but progress can serve betrayal when it reallocates power without accountability. The king's removal did more than reshape his reign, it shaped the next generation. Princes and heirs observed silently. Loyalty was provisional, power was fragile, and authority was easily displaced. Young nobles learned to obey procedure before character, to favor alliances over truth, to measure risk against patience. Decisions that once required courage now required conformity. Betrayal does not just topple a ruler, it teaches an entire generation how to survive, often at the expense of morality. The king did not resist because he had been trained to trust. Trust was his virtue. Trust had defined his reign. Trust had been rewarded in peace and prosperity. The conspirators did not confront him with violence, they presented themselves as partners. They offered counsel, efficiency, reason. By the time the king sensed the erosion of his authority, it was too late. His own principles, once the source of strength, became his vulnerability. The betrayers understood a simple truth: human ambition moves slowly. They never forced confrontation. They never provoked outrage. Instead, they acted like architects, constructing layers of dependency, systematically redirecting power, making themselves indispensable. Betrayal, in this sense, is a patient science, not a rash art. And it is far more enduring than the flash of rebellion. Exiled without leaving the palace, the king experienced isolation not as punishment but as inevitability. He walked familiar halls, attended formal gatherings, and presided over ceremonies, but no one awaited his judgment. Letters arrived filtered, friends visited briefly, and history spoke to him through memories rather than actions. This was political death without spectacle. It was a disappearance in plain sight. The systems designed to secure the kingdom outlived the men who created them. The advisor, the general, and the treasurer, all instrumental in the king's fall, vanished from prominence. Their names faded into footnotes, overshadowed by the institutional permanence they had engineered. The king, whose authority had vanished in his lifetime, became the enduring symbol. His absence became a lesson. His fall became a story. The story of this king echoes through every era. Emperors, presidents, generals, prime ministers, all are susceptible to betrayal not by enemies, but by those closest to them. The lesson is consistent. Loyalty is rarely permanent. Authority is fragile. Power is fluid. What appears as stability is often the calm before the erosion. History judges with two voices, one for deeds, one for outcomes. The king acted with wisdom, restraint, and principle. Yet the outcome rendered him irrelevant. History remembers results. Morality alone does not protect power. Leaders often assume their authority is anchored in law, tradition, or moral right. They are wrong. Authority is anchored in obedience, influence, and perception. The king's story demonstrates that losing the latter, while retaining the former, ensures a ruler's fall without dramatic confrontation. Power can slip away quietly. And by the time a ruler realizes, it is gone. Centuries later, the throne remains a symbol. A reminder that governance is more than ceremony, ritual, and law. It is a fragile negotiation between principle and ambition, loyalty and calculation, virtue and survival. The king's fall was complete, not because of enemies, but because he underestimated the patient intelligence of those around him. And this is the lesson history leaves: power is never secure. Not for a moment. The empty throne sits in silence. Light filters through the windows. Dust settles in the corners. The kingdom survives. Institutions function. The betrayers fade. Yet the story of the king endures. Not as a ruler. Not as a conqueror. Not even as a symbol of power. But as a lesson in trust, patience, and the quiet danger of underestimating those closest to you. History waits, always, for the next leader to make the same mistake. The king's children grew up under the shadow of absence. They observed courts where decisions were made without their father, advisors who owed allegiance not to family but to procedure, and generals who no longer answered to the throne. Lessons were learned silently. Power is temporary, authority is fragile, loyalty is conditional. The heirs carried these lessons into adulthood, shaping the next generation of rulers, advisors, and bureaucrats. Betrayal, once personal, became cultural. The court evolved. Institutions gained prominence while personalities faded. Positions that once answered directly to the king became independent. Committees multiplied, councils codified best practices, and traditions were framed as immutable law. The king's fall was referenced repeatedly in council deliberations. Not as a moral lesson, but as a cautionary tale of what happens when authority is centralized in one person. In this way, betrayal cemented itself not just in a reign, but in the structure of governance. The populace rarely noticed the slow erosion of authority. Markets continued. Taxes were collected. Soldiers patrolled. Borders remained secure. Yet, over decades, memory of the king's actual reign blurred. His decisions, once decisive and respected, became stories. Myths. Lessons in caution. Power without a visible face became the new normal. The king's absence shaped the expectations of loyalty, obedience, and leadership for generations. The advisor, once human, became archetype. He understood a central truth: authority can be displaced without confrontation, if the right structures exist to absorb and redistribute it. Every policy, every council, every rule he implemented was not simply administrative, it was defensive. It ensured the king could never return fully to power, and that no future ruler could wield similar independence. History rarely names such men, yet their influence persists far longer than any monarch. The general, whose army had once answered to the king, now controlled obedience indirectly. He ensured that the military functioned, but that loyalty was directed toward procedure, not personality. Force remained present, but dormant. A quiet deterrent rather than an instrument of rule. Betrayal requires no violence when obedience can be managed at a distance. The treasurer, overseeing the flow of resources, became a gatekeeper of opportunity. Funding, campaigns, and projects all depended on approval, but not the king's approval. Wealth, like power, was redirected quietly, invisibly. It did not need to be stolen, it simply bypassed the throne entirely. Across empires and eras, the same pattern repeats. Roman emperors who were puppets of the Praetorian Guard. Medieval kings who deferred decisions to regents. Modern executives sidelined by boards of directors. Betrayal does not always require assassination, revolt, or war. It thrives in patience, procedure, and perception. The king's fall is neither unique nor ancient, it is timeless. The betrayers believed they preserved the kingdom. In some ways, they did. The state endured. Civil war was avoided. Stability persisted. Yet the cost was sovereignty. Initiative was curtailed. The capacity for decisive leadership disappeared. They replaced one form of authority with another. One human hand with an impersonal machine. The kingdom survived, but at a deeper cost than anyone immediately realized. Ironically, the king's absence became his most enduring contribution. Future rulers studied his fall. Advisors memoized his restraint. Generals noted the consequences of loyalty misapplied. His story became a blueprint for survival, for those in power, and a warning for those who wield it. Sometimes, to teach a lesson, you do not need to act, you only need to be removed. The throne remained, empty yet iconic. It was polished, adorned, and revered, but it no longer signified authority. The image of power endured longer than the man. Its symbolism, more influential than the ruler it once served. This is the cruel paradox of history: presence matters less than perception. Authority can vanish, yet symbols persist. The king's story endures because it speaks to the vulnerability inherent in leadership. Trust can be exploited. Loyalty can be redirected. Authority can be hollowed without confrontation. The most dangerous betrayal is not violent. It is subtle, patient, and invisible. And by the time a ruler realizes, it is already complete. Imagine the palace centuries later. The throne sits empty. Light streams through high windows. Dust drifts across the floor. The kingdom continues. Institutions function. Society thrives. And yet, history remembers the king, not for his victories, but for the quiet, inevitable lessons of betrayal. Because in power, sometimes the absence of action is more consequential than any battle. Once the king's authority vanished, the kingdom did not collapse. Yet a subtle shift occurred. Decisions were slower, initiatives were cautious, innovation hesitated. The kingdom functioned, yes, but without vision. Leaders who followed inherited a structure perfected for survival, not for greatness. They learned the king's lesson: ambition must bend to procedure. Courage must yield to patience. The king had lost a throne, but in losing it, he had taught the kingdom to survive without him. Across the world, the same dynamics unfolded. In Renaissance Italy, princes were overthrown by advisors who controlled finance and armies. In Qing dynasty China, emperors were surrounded by eunuchs and ministers who managed power more than obeyed it. In modern bureaucracies, CEOs or presidents are constrained by boards, regulations, and invisible procedural networks. Betrayal is not isolated to any one culture or era. It is a universal feature of human governance. Silent betrayal follows a pattern. Dependency: the ruler relies on advisors for information, finances, and military support. Delegation: decisions are incrementally shifted to committees and councils. Legitimation: every change is framed as rational, necessary, or in the interest of stability. Isolation: the ruler's voice is still heard, but it no longer directs action. Normalization: absence of conflict convinces observers that authority is permanent in the new hands. Step by step, the crown remains, yet its power is hollow. In solitude, the king reflected not on battles lost, but on trust misplaced. He understood that authority is fragile. Not because of enemies outside the walls, but because human ambition is relentless. Even the best intentions, he realized, are insufficient against patient, intelligent calculation. His life became a study in absence, how leadership can vanish quietly, and yet leave lessons that echo across centuries. The king never acted out of fear. He believed restraint and principle were virtues, but in governance, virtues can be weaponized against you. By refusing to confront his betrayers, he maintained moral integrity, but surrendered authority. This paradox is central to leadership. What is ethical is not always powerful. With the king removed, power became procedural. No single individual wielded unchecked authority. Decisions were filtered through multiple layers. Leadership became predictable, yes, but slow, cautious, and impersonal. This ensured continuity, but it also guaranteed that no future king could rise without first mastering the system that betrayed the last. The king, in his absence, became an enduring lesson. Loyalty is conditional. Authority is relational. Power can vanish without a fight. Betrayal did not require swords or blood, only time, patience, and human calculation. He was remembered, not as a conqueror, but as a warning. The king learned, too late, that control is never absolute. Even the most competent ruler can be undermined by those whose patience is greater than his foresight. Institutions, loyalty, and even the appearance of stability can conceal erosion. Power is not what you hold, it is what others obey. The throne remains empty. Light streams through tall windows. Shadows stretch across marble floors. The kingdom continues. Governance endures. Society thrives. And yet, history remembers the king, not for victories, not for conquests, not for glory, but for the quiet lesson of absence, patience, and betrayal. Because the most profound political deaths are not violent, they are silent, invisible, and complete. Authority, once absolute, has a remarkable way of disappearing slowly. The king, in the months and years following his symbolic removal, discovered that governance could continue perfectly without him. He issued decrees, they were politely ignored or reinterpreted. Orders were acknowledged but not executed. The institutions he had built were still operational, yet their operation no longer depended on his will. It is a paradox of political life. A ruler can retain a crown, a palace, and ceremonial power, and still wield no real influence. In this kingdom, stability masked a profound transformation. Ministers managed themselves, generals acted without reporting, and treasury officials dictated campaigns, projects, and policies independently. Decisions were not disobeyed, they were circumvented in plain sight. The king realized, too late, that loyalty had migrated away from him, flowing toward the structures he himself had strengthened, and to those who had learned to manipulate them. Betrayal thrives not in the hands of villains alone, but in the minds of those who understand systems. The advisor, once merely clever and patient, became the true architect of change. Every council convened, every procedure codified, every committee formed served to diminish the king's influence incrementally. He understood the principle that authority is relational. If the king lost control over decision-making, over information, and over enforcement, the crown would be irrelevant, even if it remained on the monarch's head. The general, skilled in command yet equally patient, ensured that the military's loyalty shifted subtly. Soldiers no longer served a person, they served a predictable chain of command. This transformed the army from an instrument of the throne into a mechanism that reinforced procedure over personality. The treasurer, gatekeeper of resources, quietly redistributed wealth. The king's decisions required funds, but the treasury controlled the flow. Without coin, orders could not be executed. Without funding, plans remained on paper. Money became the ultimate instrument of silent authority. Together, these three men formed a triumvirate, not of malice, but of strategic foresight. They understood that power does not always need to be seized, sometimes it must be redirected. The king's defining trait, his integrity, became his weakness. He had ruled with restraint, principle, and patience. He believed loyalty was enduring, authority was inherent, and the institutions he built were inviolable. But these virtues, when wielded by a ruler surrounded by ambition, could be turned against him. Each delay in action, each attempt to negotiate or consult, allowed the conspirators to consolidate their influence. His moral restraint prevented him from confronting the inner circle decisively. By adhering to principle, he unwittingly ceded power. This paradox is central to leadership. Ethical decisions do not always preserve authority. Sometimes, they erode it. The king still believed he was acting decisively. He convened meetings, issued memoranda, sent envoys to manage crises. Yet each decision was diluted before it could affect reality. A border uprising required military intervention, but by the time the general mobilized troops, the treasury cited budgetary constraints. By the time funds were approved, the advisors had negotiated temporary truces, rendering the king's orders symbolic. Even when his authority was technically intact, it was operationally hollow. This is the subtlety of betrayal. The victim is unaware not because the threat is invisible, but because it is normalized. Gradual erosion is far more effective than dramatic coups, and far less likely to provoke resistance. In the palace, the king remained visible. Ceremonies were performed. Public appearances continued. His image was on coins, banners, and official documents. The throne remained polished. Yet symbolism had replaced substance. The visual continuity of rule disguised the complete redistribution of power. This is the cruelest form of political displacement. The world sees a ruler, hears a ruler, celebrates a ruler, but the ruler's voice no longer shapes reality. History often records the king as still reigning during this period, yet every historian familiar with the court knows he was no longer the decision-maker. His role had become ceremonial, his authority vestigial. The king's days were filled with activity, but the activity did not serve him. He attended meetings where discussions had already concluded elsewhere. He signed documents already approved in committees. He gave instructions that were interpreted by subordinates in ways he could neither foresee nor control. The king had become a spectator in his own reign. Every action was a performance, every order an echo. In this silence, betrayal reaches its apex. When a ruler retains visibility, yet all power flows elsewhere. Betrayal is rarely impulsive. It is cumulative. The advisor, the general, and the treasurer did not act rashly. They did not overthrow the king in a single night. Instead, they applied patience as a weapon. Authority was incrementally transferred. Decision-making was gradually centralized in committees. Trust was exploited slowly, teaching the king that he could not enforce commands without disruption. By the time the king recognized the threat, reversing it would require breaking his own principles, destabilizing institutions, and risking the stability of the kingdom itself. The most effective betrayals are therefore slow, legalistic, and almost invisible. This pattern repeats across time and space. Roman emperors were controlled by bureaucrats and the Praetorian Guard. Chinese emperors were manipulated by ministers and eunuchs. Renaissance city-states saw princes neutralized by financiers and advisors. Modern executives can be sidelined by boards and administrative processes without firing or scandal. The mechanism remains the same: slow, calculated, procedural displacement. The king's story is therefore not isolated, it is universal. The king believed loyalty was immutable. He believed that oaths, ceremonies, and personal bonds would protect him. He underestimated the mobility of allegiance. The general's soldiers were loyal not to the crown, but to routine and career progression. Courtiers obeyed protocol rather than patronage. Advisors obeyed systems rather than the throne. Once loyalty migrates, no symbolic authority can reclaim it. The king's children and successors observed carefully. They learned that authority is provisional, that loyalty can be redirected, and that even the most virtuous ruler can be neutralized by patience, procedure, and subtle manipulation. These lessons were internalized, shaping political behavior for decades. Nobles, military leaders, and civil servants began prioritizing system over sovereign. The king's fall became a silent curriculum for the next generation. The advisor's approach became doctrine. Committees became permanent. Councils became precedent. Rules codified for stability ensured that future kings could neither bypass procedure nor regain authority without risking upheaval. The kingdom evolved from monarchy to a hybrid system in which power was diffused. Real authority was less personal, more procedural. Stability came at the expense of decisiveness, agility, and personal accountability. Sovereignty was not destroyed by conquest or rebellion, it was hollowed out. The throne remained. The palace remained. The king's name remained. But the essence of rulership, the ability to act decisively and shape reality, had been redistributed. Authority, once concentrated, had been dispersed carefully. This is the most enduring form of betrayal. It preserves appearances while neutralizing power. The king's isolation was psychological, not physical. He was never imprisoned. He was never exiled. But his influence diminished gradually. He became irrelevant in daily governance. His advisors, generals, and treasurers made decisions without consulting him. Even the appearance of decision-making became hollow. This is a subtle form of death, to be present, but ignored. To be seen, but unheard. In his remaining years, the king became an observer of his own kingdom. He studied the successes of policies he could not initiate. He noted the failures of initiatives he could not prevent. Every decision that succeeded without him reinforced his irrelevance. Every failure reminded him of the system's immunity to his authority. History often records leaders by their victories, but psychological history is written in absence, in irrelevance, in silence. The king's virtues, integrity, patience, fairness, became constraints. To reclaim authority, he would have to act against his principles. Betrayal, in this sense, is not merely external. It weaponizes the victim's own strengths. The very traits that once ensured his legitimacy became the instruments of his undoing. The throne remained polished. The crown remained gleaming. Courtiers and citizens continued to perform rituals as if the king's authority was intact. Perception preserved the monarchy, even as reality had changed. This is the ultimate irony. A ruler can remain visible while his ability to govern has vanished entirely. This king's story persists not as a tale of tyranny or failure, but as a cautionary example of the fragility of authority. Loyalty is not guaranteed. Authority is relational. Institutions can be manipulated to neutralize power. Patience, calculation, and procedure often surpass violence in effectiveness. Leadership is always contingent. The king's children grew up under a shadow invisible to outsiders. They watched, quietly, as the machinery of the kingdom adapted to life without their father's authority. Advisors consolidated power. Military generals exercised command with minimal oversight. Treasury officials approved spending with autonomy. All the while, the king remained the ceremonial centerpiece. The children learned their lessons early. Authority is fragile, loyalty is mutable, and appearances often mask the reality of governance. These lessons were internalized as behavioral codes. Avoid confrontation, respect procedure, defer to systemic rules. They would grow up to lead not through initiative, but through navigation of established structures. Betrayal does not only destroy the present, it teaches the future. The children inherited not a throne, but a lesson in absence. They inherited a kingdom in which procedures had replaced personality, committees had replaced decisions, and rituals had replaced command. Leadership was no longer about vision or decisiveness, it was about patience, negotiation, and perception. Some scholars would later describe this as institutional maturity. The king's children understood it differently. It was survival at the expense of initiative, moral clarity, and personal power. The advisor's careful work had created a kingdom that functioned independently of any single individual. Committees oversaw policy. Councils debated strategy. Reporting chains fragmented authority. Military decisions required multiple approvals. Treasury disbursements depended on layered oversight. The king's influence became ceremonial. He could speak, but his words did not act. He could decree, but his decrees were filtered through a system designed to ensure minimal disruption and maximal control by the new power structures. This was a government that could survive any individual. The paradox: it had survived its king by hollowing out the very position that had created it. Each layer of bureaucracy, each procedural innovation, had a dual purpose: efficiency and containment. The advisor understood a truth timeless and universal: procedural power is durable, moral authority is fleeting and slow, incremental control is far more effective than sudden, violent overthrow. The general and treasurer understood this as well. Loyalty could be redirected to protocol. Influence could be exercised invisibly. And the king, unaware, could continue to preside over a system he no longer controlled. The king was not blind to the erosion of his authority. He sensed it in quiet moments: orders delayed, counsel ignored, projects stagnating. But his perception of reality was filtered by the belief that loyalty and respect would ultimately ensure compliance. This is the subtle genius of betrayal. It relies on the victim's misperceptions, patience, and ethical constraints. By exploiting virtues such as integrity, patience, and fairness, the betrayers rendered the king powerless without overt confrontation. Isolation sharpened the king's understanding. He observed meetings, listened to reports, and tracked decisions. Every success without his input, every failure he could not prevent, reinforced a bitter reality: the machinery of the kingdom now operated according to its own momentum. Observation, once a tool of understanding, became a tool of despair. The king learned that knowledge without control is a form of imprisonment. The king's virtues, integrity, patience, fairness, had once secured his authority. Now, they became the instruments of his downfall. Acting against the advisors would require violating principle. Doing nothing allowed them to consolidate influence. The moral framework that legitimized his rule constrained him when his authority was under threat. Betrayal often exploits this paradox. The victim's strengths, weaponized against them, make resistance difficult without ethical compromise. With the king's tacit consent, whether aware or not, the advisors embedded themselves into the very structures of the state. Councils became codified. Committees became permanent. Reporting chains were formalized. Every innovation carried dual utility: efficiency and control. This was governance by design. It required no loyalty, no threat, and no heroics. Authority now belonged to systems, not men. Time became the allies of the betrayers. Day by day, week by week, the system reinforced itself. Orders from the king became suggestions. Meetings concluded before his participation. Reports reached him with conclusions already decided. Eventually, the king's presence was no longer necessary. And when presence becomes symbolic while control flows elsewhere, the lesson is absolute. Real power is independent of titles or crowns. The king's heirs observed a world in which power could vanish quietly. They learned that initiative must be tempered with patience. That decisions required careful navigation of committees and councils. That loyalty could be redirected by subtle influence. These lessons became behavioral codes. Young nobles internalized them, avoiding bold action that could threaten the system. In this way, betrayal propagated through generations, not as revenge, but as education. The kingdom became risk-averse. Initiatives requiring swift action slowed to accommodate committees. Military campaigns required layered approvals. Treasury disbursements were scrutinized endlessly. The cost of efficiency was decisiveness. Courage became secondary. Risk-taking was replaced by protocol. The system survived, but it no longer thrived. The king had lost a throne, but the kingdom had gained an enduring lesson in bureaucratic resilience. Across time and space, the pattern repeated. Roman emperors displaced by the Praetorian Guard. Ming dynasty emperors constrained by eunuchs and ministers. Renaissance princes neutralized by financiers and advisors. Modern CEOs restricted by boards, committees, and compliance regulations. The king's story was therefore both unique and universal, a microcosm of a timeless dynamic. Authority can vanish quietly without overt opposition. The king faced a dilemma of morality. Acting decisively against the advisors would violate his principles of fairness, consultation, and restraint. Yet inaction allowed their influence to expand. Every day, his moral framework constrained him further. The virtues that defined his reign became tools of subversion. This is a recurring feature of political betrayal. The victim's ethical compass often becomes a limiting factor in their survival. The advisors relied on law and procedure as instruments of displacement. Every rule codified for efficiency could also be used to limit the king's authority. Every procedural innovation created leverage for decision-makers. History rarely celebrates these mechanisms, but they are profoundly effective. Betrayal does not always require arms. Sometimes it only requires patience and legality. The advisors' actions were not universally immoral. In many ways, they preserved the kingdom. They avoided civil war, mismanagement, and disruption. Yet the cost of this ethical governance was the erosion of sovereignty. Stability came at the expense of initiative. Procedures replaced individuals. Loyalty was redirected from people to structures. Betrayal, in this sense, can be both ethical and devastating. The king's role became purely observational. He attended ceremonies. He read reports. He advised in meetings, but his counsel carried no weight. Every action he undertook was mediated by layers of procedure. Decisions made in his name were often taken elsewhere. Observation, once a tool of authority, became a tool of isolation. Knowledge without influence is the cruelest of prisons. The king reflected on every moment that had contributed to his downfall. Delays in action. Over-reliance on loyalty. Excessive reliance on counsel. A belief that virtue would protect authority. Each reflection confirmed a bitter truth. Authority can vanish quietly, even in the presence of titles, crowns, and respect.